Hello, everyone. We're pleased to have you join us for Cardinal Health Lab Exchange. Welcome to today's live broadcast, IQCP. Let's get it started. I'm Brenda Kelly Kim of Lab Roots, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by Lab Roots and sponsored by Alere. Alere delivers reliable and actionable information through rapid diagnostic tests, resulting in better clinical and economic healthcare outcomes globally. For more information, please visit www.alere.com/www/en.html. I'd like to announce to our audience that in a few moments, some polls will appear on your screen. If you could take a second to answer those polls, we'd love to have the results that we can discuss during this presentation. Before we begin, though, we have just a few announcements. The webcast we're having today is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them into the green Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. If you have any technical problems hearing or seeing this presentation, please click on the support button at the top right of your presentation window or submit your problem through the green Q&A button, lower left. Following this presentation, please head on over to the Community of Learning in the Lab Exchange lobby, where you'll have the opportunity to engage in live chat and have more of your questions answered on the spot about IQPC. I would now like to introduce today's speaker, Jane Smith. Jane received her BA in Medical Technology from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville and received her master's degrees in Science, Education, and Environmental Engineering. She worked as an immunology supervisor for 30 years at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, before joining the Alere Clinical Immunology Group. In 2011, she was one of the founding members of Alere Scientific Affairs, where she now serves as a technical manager. Jane has been active in volunteering nationwide for CAP inspections. She has also volunteered in CLSI POCT 04A3 point of care IVD testing and QMS 03 training and competence assessment documents. Jane is currently directing a cross-functional IQCP team to provide IQCP support materials for Alere products. I will now turn it over to Jane for her presentation.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Brenda, for the nice introduction. As I'm speaking here, we're going to be finishing up the polls, and we'll go over that after I do my introduction. First of all, I'm delighted to talk to you about the big change in performing quality control. I know a lot of people out there are anxious about this, but this is an opportunity for IQCP to be a more inclusive approach to assuring quality. IQCPs will provide laboratories with more flexibility, and the quality control will fit their specific test in their laboratories. IQCP is also going to provide an opportunity as technology advances, and IQCP is more flexible for test of the future. And I think we've done our last poll here. We got one more to submit here, and we'll take a look at the results. Yes. And I'll X them out here. Oh, and I'm glad to see that. I'm going to do the last one first because I see it. I'm really excited to see that you're looking for pen to paper suggestions. As a medical technologist, during this presentation, I'm going to help guide you through some things that I think the inspectors are going to be looking for and easy ways to organize this. I noticed that the percentage was like 79% that people had not started on their IQCP, and guess what? That's not that much different than what we've seen in the field doing this presentation. And most of you guys are listening to these webinars and that are giving great information. So I just wanted to let you know that hopefully this presentation will be a little more practical for you for getting started on your IQCP. And with the last poll, we're going to close it out. And this is the agenda today. First, we're going to talk about how we got here, and this will be a brief history, very brief. The next thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to review the elements of an IQCP risk assessment. And believe me, this was the new portion for me. I had never done risk assessment till I started working on this project for Alere. And I believe in the laboratory, this will be new. That's why we're going to spend most of our time on the risk management concepts. We will also briefly review the quality control portion of an IQCP and the quality assessment. On the third thing, the item, as a volunteer CIP inspector, I hope to give you, as you requested, pen to paper suggestions for your inspection for preparing for an IQCP. And then next, we're going to show you some Alere IQCP support documents. And the reason we're going to be using these is because I'm really more familiar with Alere products. There are many other manufacturers out there that are providing IQCP support documents that you can use. You can even use ours, even if you don't use our products. I think you can get some good ideas from them. The principle is the same. You'll be able to translate from the Alere products into many of your other products. And finally, at the end of the presentation, we should have plenty of time for questions from each one of you. And how did we get here? And this is the brief history timeline, but I'm really going to skip ahead here. What I want to do is skip to the quality system regulations. This is when they define how they wanted quality control done. And then the next thing that followed very shortly, you notice, was within 1 year, we came up with quality control, equivalent quality control. And the CFR regulation 493.1256 for each test system, you know, you need to run controls, external controls, 2 levels or 3, depending on the specialty, that a non-wave test is performed. Please keep in mind, this is for non-wave testing. But shortly after, CMS came out with a way to reduce the number of controls, which was called equivalent quality control. People in point of care have been really familiar with how to do equivalent quality control, but I am going to go over it briefly so people can understand the history of why we managed to do a new type of quality control. This is from the CLIA brochure number 4, which you can get online from CMS. And for doing an evaluation for an option 1, this is one that monitors all the analytic components of the test system. And it's recommended that you would take your internal monitoring system, compare it for 10 days to your external QC. And after that, after medical or your laboratory director approves, you'll have at least once per month, you would only have to run your external controls. The second option that they provided was if it monitored only a portion of the process. This one was a bit longer, a 30-day consecutive study comparing external controls. Again, this one is a little bit different, at least once per week. CIP offers something very similar. If you're inspected by them, they do what's called a 20-day consecutive study. So just to keep those processes straight. As far as option 3, I have never seen it used in a laboratory, but it was definitely in the CLIA brochure. Okay, back to the history here. one thing about equivalent quality control, a lot of people in the scientific community felt that the option one of only doing 10 results was really not valid. So this is what brought us to quality control of the future. And we had experts from across the United States that had a meeting, and this included industry, laboratories, of different types. And it was decided that we really needed to look at quality control based using risk management concepts. So very luckily, CLSI developed a document that was to be used, it will be used as a reference, and that's when it was completed in 2011. This was done by Dr. Jim Nichols, and actually somebody from Scientific Affairs, Alere, was actually on the committee too. And they were really good because they gave a reference actually for the eventual letter that came out from Judy Yost in 2013 that currently gave us the timeline that we've got for doing an individual quality control plan. And keep in mind, the CLSI document is, you do not have to use the format that's in it. It's just a very good reference. I think that tools of risk management are like learning a new language, and it's very nice to have this for a reference if you're not comfortable with using risk management skills. Currently, you can use 2 to 3 levels of QC, and you can continue on if you want. Examples of people that are labs that would maybe not want to change is perhaps you only did a test once or twice a month. It might be worth just keeping on and just doing controls, external controls when you run the test. Equivalent quality control is okay right now to use it, but as of January 1st, 2016, you'll no longer be able to use it. And the other portion of it is you cannot grandfather your test in if you've done EQC in the past. You will have to convert those to IQCP. IQCP is, you can use it now, but CMS and have started inspecting and looking for it, just the starts of it. Other accrediting agencies such as Joint Commission and CAP are just recently getting their standards and checklist questions out there. So people will begin, once they see those, begin to work on their, they'll be working on their IQCPs, including that. And I wanted to, mention that I think they're already out. I'm not sure what the updates are, though, so you might want to check if you're inspected by Joint Commission or CAP. So what are the elements of an IQCP? You've got the risk assessment, you have a quality control plan, and a quality assessment. The risk assessment is new for most people in the lab. Again, this is why we need to spend most of our time today learning how to use risk management tools. Remember that risk analysis is identifying all the pre-analytical, post-analytical, pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical steps. And then you need to divide these in types of failures, which we'll go into more detail later. You're already doing quality control, but keep in mind there's a lot more to quality control than just liquid QC. It's also the things that you are always doing in the laboratory anyhow. You're reading refrigerator temperatures, you're training on new procedures and competencies, you do your task verification when you set up new testing. Quality control is a list of procedures in place to help manage the risk found in your risk assessment. True QC will prevent or detect risk. QA is just another way to monitor or track your IQCP plan. Again, you'll use your existing plan and more than likely add to your QA after you've identified new failures from looking things through a risk assessment. Note, you're going to note appropriate corrective action and evaluate if changes need to be made to your quality control plan, and the IQCP will include documentation of these changes. Things to consider for risk management. The probability of how bad it can get and how often this is going to happen is what you're really going to be looking at for risk management. Understand that a hazard is something that can go wrong, and the risk is just the probability, the severity of harm that it can happen. And a hazard from an incorrect test may not result in death. Everybody thinks the worst. And with all things, risk can never be totally eliminated. You must do, so a lot of times you need to evaluate if it's a risk benefit or not. And I'll give you an example of something that I believe is a risk benefit that's easy to understand. Again, ask these simple questions. You're going to, first of all, map out the process. You're going to look at what could go wrong, how likely it is to happen, how bad it could get, and what controls do I have to prevent or detect. This was provided by IQCP, their EP23 document, and a fishbone document is not a requirement on an IQCP, but a lot of people in the world are very visual, and so a lot of people like looking at things this way. The spine here of the fish is the process itself, and the bones that come off here represent the 5 main categories where they're the types of failure that we're going to go into later. Then along the bones, you're going to see where listed things that could go wrong. Another nice visual about this is that you can actually draw circles around the pre-analytical phase, post-analytical phase, and analytical phase, and get a good visual about your test. You also can take just your operating procedure with its steps listed and write what could possibly go wrong just out to the side. You don't need to make this complicated, but I'm going to give you several examples of how you can do this. Again, you've got to categorize the process steps. You want to look at the pre-analytical, your analytical, and your post-analytical. And this is where we have the blending of the 5 types of error. This is real important because this is something that CMS is going to be looking for. They want categories such as specimen, or test system, environment, reagents, and testing personnel. For example, for specimen, you want to maybe go back and look at a specimen rejection log. For test system review, you need to look at your maintenance logs, review your test results, your proficiency testing, and quality control. And the environment, room temperature, humidity logs, refrigerator, freezers, temps, reagents, daily QC, internal QC, lot to lot comparisons. Again, testing personnel, we're used to doing the training and the competency testing that's required for non-wave testing. Now, if you find that you're having a hard time to decide which category that this fits it under, the step-by-step guide written by CDC and CMS that's on their website now, it just says labs need to ID the 1 component's the most appropriate for your laboratory. So if you're trying to decide if it's a test system failure or a reagent failure, you can ultimately just pick one. If you decide it's the reagent is the main failure for your laboratory, then that would be what you would select. On this, we're looking about looking at failure, and we're going to do it onto the left. We're looking about how bad can it get to the left, and how often is this going to happen. And I'd like to go through a few practical examples on how to use this table. Again, this was given with permission from CLSI for use on this. And first of all, we're going to take a look at a negligible, something very inconvenient or temporary, versus something that's frequent happening. And we're going to go to the next table. It's a matrix. And we're going to try and look at the table and see if it's an acceptable risk or not. So for frequent and negligible, no, we're getting not acceptable. The best example that I could think of this is, for example, in a nursery, they decided to use new heel stick devices. And a complaint came down on the quality report that there was an increased number of babies that have bruised heels. Okay, this is when you're going to have to, go back through your quality control plan and do a risk assessment. So what are we not controlling that's causing this? Do we need to have education for our phlebotomists that are collecting the samples, or is it the heel stick device itself that we made the change through? We'll go back and give you a different example. Take a look at something that could result in patient death, but it's very improbable that it should happen. And for me, it was very surprising to see that an improbable catastrophic would be an acceptable risk. The best example that I could come up with for this one is emergency release blood. Most doctors do this because they're bleeding out when they come into the ED and they have no choice. They need to give that patient blood, but they're releasing that blood with it not being completely screened. They have outweighed the risk involved for giving that unscreened blood because there's a better risk benefit that they need blood in an emergency situation. Another way to look at assessing risk is to do it semi-quantitatively. And basically what you do is you take the frequency and the severity and the detectability and you actually score these by multiplying these three numbers together. I am not going to go into a lot of detail for you on this. The reason is that we have an instruction guide that has detailed instructions for this, but I wanted to make you aware of this. Remember, detectability helps reduce the risk, so I like that it's added if it's detectable or not. And the example we have is the values here should be established for your own laboratory, your own scales. So this is just an example. That doesn't mean it's a range. This value could be just as easily less than 50. Again, if you're interested in doing your assessing your risk this way, you can find that information in our instruction guide. The next part of an IQCP plan is the quality control. And keep in mind, you may identify processes through the risk assessment that need additional controls. Perhaps you're doing a lateral flow test and you didn't see in the insert that there was a recommended humidity range before running the test. Then that would be something you would add to doing that test. You're going to link your existing and new QC process that you discover from your risk assessment to the failures. And what you're going to do, the QC, what it's going to do is they're going to prevent and detect the failures. One advantage of IQCP is you might take a look at a QC process you're using in your laboratory and see that it's not detecting or preventing a failure. IQCP gives you the freedom to discontinue doing that quality control process if it's not needed. And the third part is the quality assurance. That's to make sure if you have a new failure during your QC process that you need to take a closer look at it. If you need to add more controls to, to prevent or detect the failure, then you will do that. After you implement the new quality control, you'll continually monitor to make sure that there are no additional failures. As a CIP inspector, I'm going to give you my viewpoint as a volunteer. I think that the checklist questions and the standards from the accrediting agencies and the guide, the step-by-step guide, are going to be the things that you're going to need to keep in mind when you get ready for these inspections. I believe that they're going to look at the process and not necessarily judge you for your conclusions. The reason that I don't believe that the conclusion is, as long as you've used adequate data and have sound reasoning, I think that some labs will have the exact same process, but they will not come up with the same conclusion. Great example would be running a test in a POL lab versus running in a core laboratory. First thing you need to do is do an operating procedure for preparing for your inspection. Keep in mind, I wouldn't start writing this first. If you guys would first take a look at doing a risk assessment for a system in your lab, and maybe a second one, I think after you've done that, it'll be very clear how to write this operating procedure. You need to be careful. CMS and the inspecting teams are going to be looking, if you do this step especially, if you have a system and you're using it in multiple places in the laboratory. For example, if you're drawing a blood gas and a neonatal heel stick versus a cardiovascular unit, there's going to be very different pre-analytical steps and different personnel and even different types of patients that's going to have to be accounted for in your IQCP. Another example is that even if you're doing multiple floors for doing evaluation, if they're doing the same thing, I would highly suggest that you do an audit and make sure that floor 1 is doing the same thing as floor 3 in a hospital. Again, this will be good documentation that you clearly looked at using the devices in different environments. You're going to review the quality control plan, the elements of it, just routine. You're going to be looking at your failures, investigations, also in your proficiency testing if you have any. You're going to also be looking at your corrective and preventable actions, and this will all be linked to your IQCP. The annual review of your quality control plan, you've been doing that as always, and again, you'll be linking these changes as you see them in your IQCP. The next step was your IQCP developed with the right personnel. This step here to me is very important. I think we're really good in the walls of the laboratory, but then when we open up, we need to know if it's collected in another area, input from those users. And also the people that are involved are also the caregivers, the physician or the nurse that's doing the treatment. You may need to branch out in your hospital to your risk assessment people or your expert, your nursing managers to give you input, especially in determining if something has acceptable risk or not. The next one down here, they're wanting enough quantity and quality of data. Examples of this could be looking back at your EQC data over the last 2 years. I give you the 2-year mark because this was the suggestion that was put in the step-by-step guide that's been put out by CMS and CDC. You can be looking at your maintenance records for the past 2 years. Remember, you've got to keep 2 years of documentation anyhow for your inspections, and it's not as much information as you think to look at, because remember, you're just looking for where there were problems. So the things that are routine, and there'll be pages of routine information there, but the things that you note that where there was a problem, that's what you need to closely look at. The last thing, remember, something to monitor the quality of the test. Remember that you always got to go back, and if there's a problem on the quality end, you just have to go back and do a new risk assessment with the added failure and take a closer look. Well, the next part's the easy part because I've been involved in this for at least over a year. And Alere is very happy that we have formed an IQCP team that's cross-functional. It's involved actually salespeople, technical service people, technical consultants in the field, marketing, scientific affairs. And what I'm about to show you are some of the things that we are providing to our customers. I'm going to talk about our Alere triage, and the reason I'm going to do that is because I'm most familiar with it, but many other vendors will have things that are very similar that you can use. First important thing that I've really got to highlight here is that any modification to the document are the sole responsibility of the facility. This is really important because once it gets in your hands and as an Excel document, it gives you flexibility, but it becomes your document. It's not Alere's document if you make changes on it. One of the things that I'm really proud of is that we've made these documents easy to get access to them and be able that you can use them in a way that's practical for you. I'm going to go over each of the columns and how you might complete this if you were doing this test in your laboratory. First column here, let me see if I can get an arrow here going because I think it'll help looking at this. The failure here, that's a failure or error. And the example we have on the first is operator failure. Cause, pretty common, not following manufacturer's instructions. Again, the 5 categories that CMS requires, we're going to tell you what that is. We consider that one to be a testing personnel error. The potential effects of the failure. We are not going to complete this for you. That is because this is for within your environment. You need to decide if this is a false positive, false negative, delayed results, or invalid results. There may or any other possibilities that you want to list in there. The next column is what the system itself can do for mitigating risk. We have guided instructions that are on the screen, are on the screen of the instrument. We also have product labeling. Product labeling includes package insert, user manual. We even manufacturers, we are required to relabel our controls, technical bulletins. All these things we provide. This is where the laboratory comes in and it becomes part of your quality control plan. You have to decide in the laboratory if that is enough risk mitigation provided by Alere. And for this example, I would say no. The things that I would add if I worked in the laboratory would be personnel testing, would get more training and will have training and competency testing. Again, we've talked about severity and frequency already, and you're going to have to determine that for your laboratory. And then the last column on the far right there, this is where you would note your SOP number, so for a reference if you had an inspector there and you needed more detail. I'm going to give some more examples so that you might get an idea of how to use the spreadsheet once you start working on your own. The next example that I'm going to give to you is this one right here, test device handling. Let's say the reagents were shipped at an improper temperature. Again, this failure is an environmental failure. Alere shipping containers are designed for your reagents to arrive at appropriate control temperature. We also talk about it in our quality control and warnings precautions. But again, on this one, I would add additional information. These are things you do automatically. For example, you would, when you immediately get a new shipment or lot, you would do a lot-to-lot comparison. So you would add that information in here. Next example is outdated test device used. This could be a testing personnel error. But one thing that's really nice, our expiration date is embedded in the device barcode, and it's read by the meter, so that's taken care of. Warnings and precautions and expiration dating is printed on every test device. This is one where the lab might say that none is needed because this is being taken care of with a barcode. This one I need to give you a little background if you're not familiar with the triage, but the reagents need to come to room temperature before it's used. A lot of places do not want to wait for the warm-up time for the reagents after they come out to the refrigerator. So with our labeling, we tell our customers that they can leave them out at room temperature, but they cannot do it beyond the 14-day room temperature storage. Again, this would be a reagent failure type, and the triage, since it's a barcode, it has no idea that if you've left that out beyond the 14 days. Again, there's more information here for labeling, and such as even a technical bulletin that describes these things. And keep in mind, this would be one you would definitely have to add more information. You would have to say that testing personnel have been educated on using a Sharpie to put a new out date because these reagent devices have been left out at room temperature. Remember, this is just a portion of your risk assessment. This is really what I talked about, where the laboratory has to look closer at everything, that they need to take a closer look at what procedures are in place or what new ones they need to add after identifying these risks. And remember, quality control, its sole purpose is to detect and prevent these failures. Alere is here to support you. I'm really proud that we are providing vendor support for IQCP. You can call into our technical services. Scientific affairs is involved. Our people in the fields of support and technical consultants are there to help you. We even have an email if you have a specific IQCP question. Be sure and email me. I think Brenda did a push through on what our webpage is. One easy way to get to it is you can Google www.alere.com/IQCP, and it does a pretty good job getting there. Once you get to that webpage, there's some really nice things for you for helping you work on your IQCP. First, our support documents are there, and like I said, you're welcome to you retrieve them and use them in an Excel format. We also have links to CMS with documents about IQCP that we believe will help you. We also have a link to our documents such as our package inserts, technical bulletins, or anything that you need as you start working on your IQCP. There's another recorded webinar that you're welcome to listen to, and also PDF, a different webinar with a different Alere product for doing an IQCP. So what do you guys think? Have we given you some ideas for making this easier? What we're going to do now is just go back over a summary of everything we've talked about today and see if that stimulates any questions at the end. Remember, we talked about you're going to have to do a standard operating procedure, the risk assessment, package insert, I think I've already talked about, vendor information, this would be your user manuals, technical bulletins, maybe your call history into technical services at Alere, maybe it would be anything like a history on the instrument, lab information, that would be your competencies and your trainings and your environment, all these things you're going to have to take a closer look at. Clinical requirements, again, that's when you bring that group of people in that are going to be able to evaluate if it's acceptable or not risk to be doing the test this way. Regulatory requirements, be very careful with this, check with local and state and even your accrediting agencies, because I do believe they're going to be different from place to place. Again, how do I prepare? You collect your data. Again, the historic data you can use. And this is just the parts of the risk assessment. Again, you identify the failures from your risk assessment and where they happened, calculate how often, and evaluate if there's an impact or not. You can map. This is another example. Instead of a fishbone diagram, you can do a mapping process. Again, this is up to you on how you like to look at your processes in your laboratory. You categorize them in the steps of the 5 different categories of types of failures. Right now, I'd like to kind of talk about a way you can do this with these Excel spreadsheets. You could divide your Excel spreadsheet and do a sort on just specimen, or you could do analytical or pre-analytical and just make an extra column and label your pre-analytical steps, and you can have those sorted as a spreadsheet. As you start working on these spreadsheets, you can just maybe have a main IQCP plan and it be the main tab, but the second tab would just be the exceptions for those places where there are additional things that have to protect from failure that you'll be including in your IQCP. So again, the flexibility, I believe, of using Excel is going to help a lot of people in the laboratory. Again, you're going to ask, what could go wrong out there? How likely it is to happen? How bad it could get? And you have the right controls in place? Or after doing your risk assessment, do you need to add new controls? Again, filling out these tables, it's not an exercise in making sure the form is complete. It's about looking at quality control in a whole different way, in an all-inclusive way. In closing, I know your first IQCP, if you've not done one yet, it really is a pretty painful experience the first time you do it. I remember, for example, that the first one we did for a risk assessment, it took us weeks to get through all the different failures. But one thing I found that once you've done one, it's a lot easy. Many tests or systems have many commonalities. So as we've done, we're going to have up to 20 different support documents eventually added to our webpage. I've gotten much better at looking at risk assessment, so practice helps. Remember, as we discussed in this presentation, that controls are much, much more than just doing your liquid controls and bringing all the things in that you routinely do in your laboratory. You're just tying that into your IQCP. One of the things about that is that the step-by-step guide, I really like. They had some nice Excel documents for quality control to be listed separately with an IQCP, and also quality assessment. So take a closer look at those and see if those will help you for organizing. Like I said, this is about things you're already used to doing in the laboratory, and this is a shift from doing just the regulatory compliance to doing quality control for our test in the laboratory. And I want to thank everyone for your participation today. And it's up to you to ultimately decide if you want to do IQCP. If you're more comfortable with just doing 3 levels of control daily, that's fine. You can do that. That is acceptable. Remember, IQCP may not reduce the number of controls you're currently using, but it will help you definitely understand better the things about quality control for the procedure you're doing. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for that informative presentation. We're so happy to have you part of Cardinal Health Lab Exchange. I'm just going to remind our audience how to ask questions. You can submit them with the green Q&A button. Type your questions into the box. It can be found on the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And we do have one question already from Cynthia at Cardinal Health. She asks, if using EQC today, can you opt to do external QC daily rather than IQCP?
I'm not exactly sure of your question. If you could clarify, or do you, instead of doing EQC, that you would like to do daily external controls instead of doing IQCP?
That's the question as I have it. Yes, that's correct.
If you choose that you don't want to use EQC, well, you're not going to be able to use it, I'll be honest with you. You would have to convert to using external controls daily, each day of use of your test, because that is the new requirement if you do not do IQCP.
Okay, our next question comes from Dottie at Capital Region Medical Center. How does the CLSI streamlined QC plan for microbiology fit in with IQCP?
I'll be honest with you, I'm not as familiar with things in microbiology, but it was just recently I've noticed that ASM has given some great support for microbiology and doing IQCPs, and I would go to them if you haven't seen that yet. I think they're going to be a great reference and guide everybody in microbiology on how to use IQCP.
Thanks. Our next question from Lushanda at St. Francis Medical Center. How will this work for susceptibility QC for micro?
I'm going to give a repeat answer because I actually saw some IQCP templates for that. Again, I would go to ASM assistance for those.
Great. Our next question comes from Chang. Are there software programs for IQCP?
Yes, there definitely are. One of the ones out there is extremely detailed and one is more general. And again, you're going to have to decide what is going to work best for you. I can't promote either one, but there are two out there and they are available. I actually have looked at both of them and they are really, nice thing about them is I'm a person that likes something that's computer assisted, cueing you what you need to do. And one of the benefits of one of these programs is that it asks you every question, really. You don't have to think about it. The more detailed asks all the questions. The other one gives you more a general high-level view.
Great. We have one last question from Max at Benefis Health System. Would IQCP be required on a waived test system?
Definitely not. If you're using the test as waived, IQCP is not required.
Great, thanks. That's what we have time for. I do want to thank our sponsor, Alere, for making today's educational webcast possible. Please make sure to head over to the community of learning following this presentation, and you'll have an opportunity to engage in live chat with James Smith and your peers, as well as have answers to more of your burning questions in regards to IQCP. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through October of this year. You'll receive an email from LabRoots alerting you when that broadcast will be available for replay, and we invite you to share that email with any colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Thank you for coming. We'll see you next time.